Hey everyone, Ewan from WhatCulture Gaming here with a video about everyone's favorite little gaming franchise, Grand Theft Auto. It's only a matter of time until Rockstar lift the lid on their next project, and so far, all signs point towards it being another entry in the ludicrously successful Grand Theft Auto franchise. The prevailing rumor so far is that the game, developed under the working title Project Americas, will be set across multiple eras and pull heavy inspiration from shows and films like Narcos and Scarface, giving players the opportunity to take control of a drug runner as they perform missions between Latin America and the United States, rising through the ranks as they go. And it all sounds very exciting. If those rumors are to be believed, it looks as though Rockstar are taking everything they learned working on both GTA 5 and their epic Old West tale, Red Dead Redemption 2. There's meant to be a heavy focus on realism and immersion, as well as a number of cities to explore in what will supposedly be the studio's most ambitious open world to date. By all accounts, if those rumors are true, then it's everything the series fans are after, right on down to the purported setting of 80s America, which is famously utilized in the fan-favorite GTA Vice City. Even so, there is one setting that I feel Rockstar will benefit from immensely if they were to ever utilize it in one of their own titles, and one that would benefit GTA in particular, that of the long 1960s, or more specifically, the golden age of America's post-war boom. In the years following World War II, the United States embarked on a rapid and radical transformation. The economy was booming, living standards increased, but intense disquiet bubbled beneath the surface, with social inequality in the Cold War coming to define the era in a great many ways. TLDR, it was far from the serene, nostalgic slice of Americana folks liable to call the cops on their neighbor's barbecue love to harken back to, and it's a setting ripe for exploration. If you'll permit me to put on my wanky history graduate face for just 1 second, the long 1960s, defined by historian Philip Jenkins in Decade of Nightmares as beginning midway through the 1950s before crashing to a halt in 1972, is a period that's almost synonymous with the crime genre. Francis Ford Coppola's first two Godfather films employed the setting to great effect at the beginning of the 70s, as have certain works by director Martin Scorsese, while Donald Westlake's Parker novels went to great lengths to apply a noir filter to the pastel pinks and yellows of the era. More on both of those later. In essence, the contrast between the out-facing image of the US pre-1962, one of prosperity and tranquility, and the darker historical reality of the time has provided ample fodder for creatives for decades. It's kind of tailor-made for Rockstar's flagship franchise, so sit back and buckle in as we head straight down to Fat City. I'm Ewan Patterson, this is WhatCulture Gaming, and here's my pitch for the GTA game that Rockstar probably won't make. Red Dead and LA Noire, why Rockstar's natural home is the past. Rockstar are unique in the video game industry. They don't operate like other studios or publishers, and they do games differently, exemplified best by their most recent effort, Red Dead Redemption 2. Red Dead 2 is one of the most ambitious video games ever made, and one that elected to tell its narrative in a uniquely character-driven way. Cutscenes are left to detail key narrative moments, but a lot of the relationships the player develops as Arthur Morgan over the course of the game occur in real time, mingling in the camp or doing certain missions. Factor in the level of immersion on offer mechanically, with players being forced to look after themselves, their weapons, and their camp, and it's safe to say there isn't an experience quite like it. As a Western epic, Red Dead 2 also grapples with a lot of historical themes. It's not the first by any means, and one could even argue that the narrative thrust of both that title and the first Red Dead Redemption was lifted straight from works like The Wild Bunch and Unforgiven, that being the end of the Old West, but it's still immaculately handled, and typifies why the studio seemed to work best when submerged in the past. If any word were to describe Red Dead 2, it would be authentic, and the same goes for the studio/publisher's other most recent efforts set in the past, LA Noire. Developed by the now sadly defunct Team Bondi, LA Noire was set in 1947 and took heavy inspiration from film noir, putting players in the shoes of Golden Boy Cole Phelps as he peeled back the lid on prosperous post-war America, investigating grisly crime after grisly crime as a part of the LAPD. Ironically, it would also transpire that Cole himself harbored his own dark secrets, a reflection, perhaps, of Tinseltown after World War II. Red Dead and LA Noire stand out to me as the two most compelling offerings from Rockstar over the last decade, and I think it comes down to both series' settings. Both those titles ultimately seem more confident in their approach, grappling with historical themes and capturing the respective zeitgeist of the Old West and 1940s Los Angeles than GTA does with its scattergun approach to satire in the here and now. Granted, that's a part of the series' charm, but fans are ready for a more mature Grand Theft Auto, one that pulls inspiration from Rockstar's more considered works. Post-war America, the perfect storm. But why the 1950s and 60s? What exactly about that era would lend itself to a Rockstar title? Well, for starters, there's the clash of imagery. There's a general misconception that the US post-World War II and pre-JFK's assassination was a land of diners, drive-ins, and not drives, but youthful innocence. A perception no doubt exacerbated by the immense economic growth the country underwent following the war. And yes, while it's true that a great many Americans did become more prosperous, the reality is far more complex. The Red Scare, spurred on by the US's burgeoning conflict with the other superpower of the time, the USSR, engendered a culture of political persecution and wild anti-communist hysteria. Black servicemen returned home from overseas only to be met with de facto and de jure segregation and a resurgent Ku Klux Klan, and the women's liberation movement was still a decade away from becoming a genuine force. And therein lies the central appeal of America's long 1960s for storytellers. The outward-facing impression of the era is one so at odds with historical reality that it enables creatives opportunities to confront it again and again. Stories like The Graduate and even David Lynch's Blue Velvet both tackle the tragedy and then horror that the suburbs ostensibly masked, while Coppola's Godfather helped enshrine the notion that such unfettered economic growth was entwined with criminality. This in mind, it wouldn't be difficult to envision a version of GTA grappling with both of these themes, along with the other political crises of the time. Hangar 13's Mafia 3 offers the perfect blueprint in this regard, with the game depicting the story of one Lincoln Clay, a black Vietnam veteran who finds himself out for revenge in 1968, one of the most tumultuous years in modern US history, all the while dealing with systemic racism in the Deep South. Mafia's attention to detail is peerless in that regard, and something Rockstar could learn from with their future efforts regardless of the setting. The retro aesthetic, capturing a sense of time and place. Okay, so after all that talk about the 1950s and 60s projecting a fake image that masked a darker reality, it's time to admit something. The retro aesthetic is incredibly charming. If it wasn't, then Bethesda's Fallout series wouldn't be nearly as charismatic as it is, and you wouldn't have half as many cringe memes from folks begging to be back in the 50s. You know, just ignoring all the discrimination and the imminent threat of nuclear annihilation. Haha, class. So yeah, this is where I'm going to take a bit of a tangent, if I haven't already, and explain where all of this came from. For those who've been watching WhatCulture Gaming for the last few years, you may know that I'm also the comics editor of WhatCulture.com, and one of my favorite comic book creators is the late Darwin Cook, an extremely talented writer/artist who first carved out a reputation working on the DC animated shows of the late 90s, and one who sadly passed away in 2016. After working on shows like Batman Animated Series and Batman Beyond, Cook made the transition into comics, and his style distinguished him almost immediately. It was cartoony and vibrant, and the Art Deco stylings of BTAS, pioneered in the 1940s by the Fleischer Superman cartoons, translated perfectly to the page. It wasn't long before Cook crafted what many would consider to be his magnum opus, The New Frontier, a story that applied the real history of the 1950s and 60s to the DC universe during the golden and silver ages of comics, which concluded, incidentally, around about the same time historians generally believe the long 1960s did. Cook's love for the visuals of that era were more than apparent in that story, but obviously I'm not suggesting that the next GTA should take inspiration from a superhero comic. No, the comic I am suggesting it take inspiration from is another of Cook's works, those being his adaptations of Donald Westlake's Parker novels, which released between 2009 and 2013. For those not familiar with Westlake, who wrote the books under the pseudonym of Richard Stark, the author created the character of Parker, a master thief, in 1962, with his debut story being The Hunter. A number of follow-up books came after, and so too did a number of unofficial movie adaptations. Cook's graphic novelizations, however, stand head and shoulders above all the others, mainly because they're so beautiful to look at and adhere to the original settings of the novels, with the events of The Hunter taking place in '62 and the final adaptation, Slayground, taking place in 1969. It isn't difficult to see how Rockstar could take advantage of a Parker-esque story, or especially the aesthetic of the comics. Classic sports cars and retro fashion would be great to mess around with in a fully fledged title, as would period-accurate weaponry and architecture. Plus, given we've seen Rockstar take immersion to new heights in Red Dead, there should be no worries that they'd be able to do the same with the 50s and 60s, both narratively speaking and gameplay-wise. Is nostalgia for Vice City driving the next GTA? You see, while I'm still very much looking forward to whatever Rockstar have planned next, no matter the setting really, if the rumors are true that we're going back to Vice City in and around the 70s and 80s, I am a little concerned that it'll be driven primarily by nostalgia. The nostalgia pendulum swings every 2 or 3 decades, and so you'll probably notice that the 80s and 90s are very in vogue currently, more so the latter than ever before. There's also a general level of nostalgia for games released on the 6th generation of consoles as of late, with remakes and remasters growing in frequency with every year. In regards to GTA specifically, it seems as though every year fans beg Rockstar to conjure something to do with Vice City, the series' stand-in for Miami that captivated imaginations in 2002. With that in mind, rumors that the next game will head back to Vice City shouldn't be all that surprising, especially when you consider how Rockstar already returned to Liberty City and Los Santos in GTA 4 and 5 in 2008 and 2013 respectively. The issue here isn't so much that I don't think Rockstar have genuine cause to revisit Vice City, or even that they won't be able to do anything interesting with it. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's more just that it feels like the most predictable move they could make right now, taking into account current nostalgic trends and the yearly demands from fans to head back to the 80s and rekindle memories of Tony Vercetti, Lance Vance, and the old Pegassi in Furnace. And hey, look, I totally get it, I really do. Watching Don Johnson and reruns of Miami Vice sets off the urge to jump back into Vice City all over again for me too, and I have no doubt that Rockstar could make another great GTA game set in that era. I just think it's time for something new, in the vein of LA Noire or Red Dead, that delves into a relatively untapped era of US history, at least when it comes to video games. But I want to hear your daft gaming pitches down in the comments below. Is there any setting you'd like to see GTA utilize in the future, or do you have an idea for where any of Rockstar's other franchises might go next? Once you've done that, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and head back on over to whatculture.com/gaming, where you can consume content like this, but in the written word. If you're looking for a good book recommendation, be it a history book or something comic booky, give me a shout over on Twitter at YouMaroonsThings. That's all for now though. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye!